For a perspective from a private sector laboratory, Dr. Barry Logan will be the next speaker. Dr. Barry Logan is a chief scientist at NMS Labs and the executive director at the Center of Forensic Science Research and Education at the Frederick Reeder's Family Foundation, Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. Dr. Logan is a fellow of the American Board of Forensic Toxicologists and has had over 140 publications and over 500 presentations in forensic toxicology and analytical chemistry. And in addition to all that, in 2013, 2014, he was the president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Please welcome Dr. Barry Logan.
Good morning. So I'm going to talk about my specific discipline, forensic toxicology, and private sector perspective on that. I think it's very encouraging. I hope you'll find that many of the themes that I'll talk about are things that have already been brought up by perspectives from the academic and practitioner communities. My disclosure is that I am an employee of NMS Labs. We're a commercial provider of forensic science services in toxicology, serology and DNA, and seized drug analysis. The National Academy of Sciences report on forensic science has been referenced earlier, and I think often we think of that report as it was viewed at the time as kind of an indictment of some of the limitations of forensic science casework, but it also called out limitations in research as well as in practice. And many of the innovations that we've seen over the last 10 years since the issuance of the report, with the development of standards, the development of the OSAC organization within NIST, have been a reflection of a desire to improve practice through investment in research. Of the 13 recommendations in the NIST report, research is mentioned multiple times in many of the recommendations. I think tellingly, it's mentioned 5 times in recommendation 1, which was for the establishment of a National Institute of Forensic Sciences, one of the things that has not been implemented since the publication of the NIST report. And one of my arguments as I conclude later this morning will be that one of the things we're missing, I think, that can contribute to the success of implementation of research is the lack of a national strategy for forensic science research and any kind of governance of that kind of plan. We certainly have a lot of stakeholders, whether it's the OSAC subcommittees, ASCLAD, who are making, and the work of NIJ through its listening sessions, who are creating lists of research opportunities and projects, but in terms of prioritization, we don't have a concerted national strategy. I also just wanted to point out that I am talking from the private sector perspective, and the private sector is called out in multiple places in the NIST report as an important stakeholder in the advancement of and strengthening of forensic science. So I'm really pleased we have an opportunity to be here and represented in this event for the next 2 days. So we've heard a lot about research. I went back to the Merriam-Webster definition because different types of research are better suited to different kinds of stakeholder groups with different resources to address different kinds of problems. But the dictionary definition does include the fact that that research covers the invention or discovery of new things, new facts, and also, interesting, the revision of accepted theories and laws in the light of new facts as we go back and evaluate the underpinnings of some of the basis for some of our disciplines within forensic science. And then they also include in the definition the practical application, so implementation of these new and revised theories or laws that fall under the definition of research. So constellation of applications that might include are everything from invention of a new technology, new types of sources for mass spectrometry, new types of data processing in high-resolution mass spectrometry, And then the application of these two new technologies to solve forensic science problems. So matching up what industry has created, the resources they've created with a problem that we need to solve in our disciplines. Further down the road is the adaptation of published methods. So people have adapted new technologies, they've published these, then the adoption or implementation of these in casework analysis is another form or another component of the research process. And then once the technology is implemented, understanding in validation what its limitations and error rates might be, and then post-implementation how it performs in the real world. And then our laboratories all generate data, and there's increasing attention on the opportunity and potential for analysis of big data sets and what can tell us about patterns of crime or patterns of demand for forensic science services. All of these might fall under the umbrella of research priorities or opportunities, but not all of them are necessarily well assigned or well mapped to every kind of organization that might have a stake in performing research. So we've heard on the academic perspective, which has a lot more opportunity to explore different applications of new technologies. I'd include also, along with universities, a small number of nonprofit research organizations, one of which, as Robert mentioned, I am involved with, and I'll talk about how through our private sector organization we partner with our nonprofit. National laboratories have been mentioned. The federal government spends about $12 billion a year on its 17 national laboratories, providing support to the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy. And organizations like the FBI and NIST also have forensic science research programs. The DOE laboratories, many of them also have forensic research groups too. Government practitioner laboratories, as we've heard, the focus is more often on adoption or implementation of new technologies. If they have the resources, these tend to be larger kinds of departments or organizations. In smaller practitioner organizations, it's more to do with validation of technologies that are further down the path towards acceptance. Private sector laboratories occupy kind of a middle ground. I'll talk about the importance of innovation to the business model of private forensic science service providers. And then, as has also been mentioned, the critical role of technology companies in creating the opportunity for the development of new techniques, many of which can be commercialized. So if you try to match up what some of the types of research needs might be with the stakeholder groups that might have an interest in performing that, technology companies frequently have solutions that are looking for a problem. Gene Peters addressed a little bit in his presentation. I think if you have a solution and you're trying to force it onto a particular problem, that's maybe not the best way to solve it. But knowing what the various different tools that might be becoming available or might have recently been invented such that you can select the right technology, I think is an important level of awareness that we need to have as, again, we move down the innovation continuum. In academia, again, an opportunity for more basic kinds of research. But in my experience, frequently, particularly at smaller universities that have more of a teaching focus and a research focus, the research projects students work on don't really have any prospects of being implementable. So one of the other things that I think where we have an opportunity in terms of removing barriers is more communication between practitioners and academia, whether that's public sector or private sector. In the national laboratories, they are funded very well to do some targeted projects. A huge amount of money is spent, for example, on nuclear forensics, something that we don't often see in the criminal justice setting. But with respect to other areas that they're working on, how are these projects prioritized, and are they aligned with the needs of the various different practitioner stakeholder groups? And then government practitioners typically and appropriately have a casework focus. but are looking for ways to do things better or faster or less expensively. But their research focus really is on typically the validation portion of technologies or methods that are a little more mature. And then the private sector, I think, has an opportunity for a middle ground between some of the more basic research and some of the more mature research in order to innovate and create a commercial opportunity that the public sector laboratories, at least early in that cycle, are not able to offer. William McAndrew from Project Foresight at WVU a few years ago published a paper examining the likelihood of privatization in the practice of forensic science. And some of the things that he calls out as part of the value proposition for the private sector is the incentive to innovate, to have a product that your customers are not able to create themselves. And then also, so that's one opportunity. The other is to offer a service or a test at on a more cost-effective basis than a public sector organization can offer. And that entrepreneurs have a strong incentive to create profit by innovating, by lowering prices, and by increasing the quality of the product. There are certainly arguments against blanket privatization of provision of forensic science services because in the absence of a strong quality framework, there is a significant risk of a race to the bottom in terms of pricing. And quality frequently becomes a casualty in that kind of environment. And that has happened in other places around the world. I think we are in an enviable position in the United States of having a very strong quality framework that has been driven and evolved largely from the pressure and influence and insight of the public service laboratories. But in order to compete, private sector laboratories have to meet the same quality standards that any public sector laboratory would have to meet. Another thing that will drive that quality would be more mandatory requirement for accreditation. Particularly in the field of toxicology, there are still many laboratories that are not accredited that are doing forensic casework. There are only 10 states in the United States that require that accreditation. McAndrew also points out that it may be the case that private companies, since we're investing our own money in the development of our research and development efforts, have to be more efficient in terms of how we use that, the available research funding, because we're more accountable for the success or failures of these projects. So picking the right projects and picking projects that are going to enable you to recover the investment of the research cost is really critical. And then another part of this phenomenon is that when a company does create a test, if it has some novelty, actually typically has a relatively limited life cycle, because as the demand for the test becomes more widespread, both other private sector laboratories and public sector laboratories are going to create the ability to do the test themselves. So there's a continual drive towards a need for ongoing innovation in the private sector in order to remain a commercially viable concern. So how do private laboratories compete? We can really only be successful at scale. So for example, a test that may have a low level of demand in any individual laboratory, if you can consolidate that demand, and if we can do 5 tests from 200 laboratories, that then maybe becomes something that we would invest these resources in, whereas any individual laboratory wouldn't create it to do 5 tests of their own. But we do have to have a high level of technical expertise, obviously. We have to have excellence in quality. In the private sector, if there's a quality failure, typically the client frequently has the alternative of going back to the government services, which is provided often for free, at least to that agency. So we have to have a strong value proposition as to why people would want to work with a private provider, and innovation and new products is part of that value proposition. So we need to identify the need for a new test early, be nimble in terms of creating a solution. We can be better prepared for those opportunities by working closely with technology vendors to bring technologies on board for assessment and implementation that are going to help us be prepared to solve analytical opportunities, to develop and deploy these tests effectively. Messaging about the availability and value of these tests is important. Chip Pollock, in his example of a public-public partnership, talked about getting that messaging to the district attorneys. In the commercial laboratory world, we have to make sure that people know about the availability of the new tests that we are bringing out. Chip called that messaging. We would call it marketing, but it's effectively the same thing. Like any organization, we do have to be, we have limited resources and we have to manage them very carefully. So we have a couple of different processes that we use for vetting the opportunities for the development and implementation of new techniques or tests. This is done through a group within our organization called our R&D Governance Committee, which is responsible initially for vetting new opportunities. And as I'll mention, if something is going to be a very significant investment that's outside the normal budget of the R&D governance group, then that has to go to an investment council at the executive leadership of the level of the organization. But the R&D governance group will review, we encourage solicitation of ideas for new tests from our customers, from our staff, from our scientists, people who are attending, meeting, interacting with their peers through their network. We also get a variety of calls. In fact, we have an application in our customer service menu called Do We Do? And probably 3 or 4 times a day we'll get a call from somebody saying, do you do this test? And if it's something we don't do, we log these calls, and these are reviewed every month to see if there's a developing demand for something that we maybe haven't offered in the past. So the projects come to the R&D governance group. They're assessed for whether they're a true forensic application, what the messaging or academic potential is. We're pretty open about our methodologies. We publish a lot of the methods that we develop and validate in the peer-reviewed literature. We actually view that as a way of communicating the testing opportunities that we have available. We look at a new product as from the perspective of how effectively can we get the word out about it, who's the audience we're trying to get that information to. We'll look at our track record in developing similar tests previously. Have they been successful? What kinds of problems have we run into? How does that help predict the likelihood of a successful outcome? Whether it meets an articulated need from the community, and then an assessment of whether it's a technology, there are technology solutions that we have in-house that can be applied, or whether we would have to go outside of our routine or our current battery of technology to address the problem. There's also a cost analysis, and we do a revenue potential assessment, which is very often kind of a finger in the wind. We use a process called Voice of the Customer, so we have an idea of what the demand for a test is likely to be. Our marketing team will assess the price sensitivity, how much is somebody prepared to pay for that test. And we look at the 5-year potential for revenue generation against the cost of developing and implementing and marketing the test. And then the proposal is reviewed by the R&D governance group, and then, as I mentioned, if it's going to require a significant investment of new technology by our corporate investment group. So this is a little cartoon about how we rank or categorize these opportunities to decide whether to move them forward. So we're basically plotting on the y-axis here the financial opportunity, the market receptivity, and the need against the challenge in terms of technology requirements and the value of its academic potential or its marketing potential. So things that are Relatively easy to do. We have the technology on board to do them. Maybe it's a variation of an existing test, and there's a significant revenue potential. It's considered a bread and butter test. The example I have here was actually a recent test we developed for phosphatidyl ethanol, which is a marker for long-term ethanol use. That fell into that quadrant of something that there's a market for. We have the technology to do it. It's a relatively simple method. Previous methods have been published. We're confident that we can bring that to market pretty fast. The upper right is the pearl in the oyster. So these are tests that are going to require some more investment, but there's a good indication that there is an unmet need for that test in the market. So these are the ones that can be a little more difficult to justify. There's obviously more risk involved there because we're going to have to either buy a new piece of equipment or bring on a new expertise. The bottom left are the tests that very often people just expect us to be able to do because they come to us for more esoteric testing and it's within our capabilities. We may decide to do these even though the revenue potential is not good. It protects our brand and our reputation and helps bring customers back for some of the more profitable testing we'd hope to be able to work with them on. And then the bottom right is the so-called white elephant tests that would be cool to do, that could help solve a very critical case, but would require a lot of investment, and we're not likely to find many customers for that test. Sometimes we will decide to do that, but we also, as I'll describe, partner with our nonprofit organization and pass many of those opportunities that are not really commercializable onto them as research projects. So our process is through the vetting process, through our R&D governance and investment council to either approve the test, deny the approval. Frequently, tests will come back. They're kind of called zombie proposals sometimes. You just can't seem to kill them off. But maybe the market changes or the demand changes or we bring on a technology for a different application and now it opens up an opportunity we might previously have rejected. And then some of the tests that we're not going to develop as a fully validated assay, we may develop as a special investigation, which is a mini validation centered around the casework, and we use techniques like standard addition to help with the validation of the data for that particular case. These tend to be very expensive, and we do relatively few of these, but we never want to deny somebody the opportunity to have work done as a project rather than as a commercial test if there's a substantial need in their case. We use a number of different tools for project management. So the pipeline suggestions that we're getting either from customers or from the literature or from working with our colleagues go into a project management tool. We use Jira, which is an Atlassian product for that. And it tracks the progress of the proposal through the vetting procedure. And then once tests are approved, we also use the same software for project management. And we monitor very carefully the progress of the project. One of the very difficult things for us is deciding in some cases that we're not making the expected progress of a case with a project or the market changes and we have to kill the test off. We may have invested often sometimes some significant money in these projects and there's always the temptation to try to see it through to the end, but you have to have some discipline about recognizing when you just need to write off your losses and move forward with what the next opportunity is. So I mentioned that some of the tests that are not approved through our process for market reasons or technology reasons, we may pass these on to an allied organization, the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education. That's a nonprofit organization that was started by the founder of our company. It's been around, this is our 25th anniversary year. And the center has had a focus on more research activities for the last 10 years. So some of the things that, for example, have not been developed as commercializable tests at NMS, but which have created project opportunities at our foundation, include work we're doing on LC-MS proteomic studies for identification of origins of biological fluids. We have did some preliminary work developing a test for insulin and insulin analogs in postmortem material. We were able to take that early work and were recently successful in having development of that project funded through the foundation by NIJ. We a couple of years ago looked at whether we wanted to be an early adopter in next-gen sequencing. Decided that NMS did not want to do that, but we have started a project in next-gen sequencing through the foundation in collaboration with one of the major vendors. Private sector solutions, in terms of support of the forensic science infrastructure, we're really looking for, we really view our opportunities as in partnership rather than replacement of public sector laboratories, and being able to work with public sector laboratories to have them outsource esoteric tests or low volume tests creates a consolidated demand that basically is the business proposition for our organization. And again, having to continually have novel tests that are going to attract that kind of business is an incentive for innovation and disciplined implementation. The areas that we focus on are what are emerging needs, new drugs, esoteric tests that again are more feasible if you can consolidate demand, technology-specific opportunities based on technologies we've invested in or we've partnered with vendors on. So at NMS we're evaluating things like laser diode thermal desorption sources and ion mobility sources to see if they can either enable us to do testing more rapidly or more comprehensively, more sensitively, and we then would be able to offer that as part of our value proposition. And then looking objectively at what it would cost to develop the test, making an assessment of what it would cost public service providers to do that, and then being able to make the argument to them for the value of outsourcing that work. So in terms of, to bring this back just in closing to research, this is kind of how I laid out a lot of what I've already talked about. And where the private laboratory contribution to research, development and implementation is. So we certainly rely on work that's done in our academic research centers, in the national laboratories, at NIST, at academic centers of industry, of excellence in industry, to create ideas or technologies that we can leverage. And our opportunity is to innovate, to make these applicable, to make them implementable, to do applications development, to do discovery, for example, of new metabolites that can be part of a test that make it unique, and then to meet that emergent need. So all of our R&D effort is really focused around these activities. And we like to envision these as supporting the public sector laboratories whose focus is on provision of casework services, by presenting and publishing, well, by making the test available commercially for however long its life cycle is, but by presenting and publishing the methods that we've developed to reinforce our support role and relationships with our customers. And then the public sector laboratories also have a lot more insight, certainly, into research and reporting on error, uncertainty measurements, bias, and then the trends in the data that their laboratories are producing. So just to close, I wanted to take the opportunity of having the platform just to address some other things that I think I've already heard from other speakers, but I think that are going to contribute towards this discipline-wide effort to move from innovation to implementation. I mentioned earlier the lack of any national research strategy for forensic science or prioritization across all of our organizations. The NIJ listening sessions have produced a 12-page document that is a list of important and viable research opportunities. The OSAC subcommittees have their own lists, which and probably need to be continued to be updated. I think there could maybe be some more focus on updating of research priorities by the subcommittees. And then ASCLAD has produced its own research priorities. But it would be nice to see some coordination around those, particularly if we want to make a case for larger federal investment in forensic science research. I, like Mr. Pollack, can't overstate the importance of working with technology vendors. They really create an opportunity for a lot of innovation, particularly within our space. We, certainly through our nonprofit, not through NMS, but we do apply for research grants through NIJ, and these have been extremely helpful to our research and teaching mission. But these research grants from NIJ typically do not allow the purchase of new technology or instrumentation. So any public service organization or nonprofit organization who's applying for these grants would have to find the funding for the technology from someplace else. Some of that is available through programs like the Coverdell opportunities, but labs frequently struggle through that competitive process to get access to things that might open up opportunities for innovation for them. If anybody in this room is not familiar with Jeff Teitelbaum, who's the forensic librarian with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory System, I'll be happy to give you his contact information. He runs an invaluable service in terms of distributing information about tables of contents, open source publications, full text online publications in the forensic science that are available to anybody. I think one of the major limitations we frequently have in our public laboratories, and I ran a state laboratory system for 10 years, was access to the literature. Those of us who have academic appointments or adjunct appointments frequently have some of that access, but many laboratories struggle to get copies of full text manuscripts and frequently will make decisions based on reading abstracts. Investing in a service that gives our forensic scientists better access to the forensic literature, I think would be a huge, would pay off in many respects. We've heard a couple of things about opportunities for more interaction between people doing casework and research, the FBI fellowships, the opportunities for research students to work on research projects in laboratories that are doing research. I think that helps create an appetite and interest in research amongst young scientists, and it ensures that they're going to be working on projects that are in fact implementable, and maybe plant the seed within their forensic science programs as to more productive directions for research. We do spend a lot of money on national laboratories for defense and the environment. Maybe we should have a national laboratory for forensic science if we're not going to have a National Institute of Forensic Science. And then perhaps we should consider centers of excellence for particular disciplines. Again, we heard about the trace evidence initiatives in Sacramento County. That might be an opportunity to form some regionalized demand for specialized services that any one individual laboratory wouldn't be able to justify developing. So I appreciate your attention. I'm glad I had the opportunity to talk particularly about the private sector contribution. But I think what I've learned from my participation here this morning is just how closely aligned the needs of academia, public sector and private sector truly are. So thank you. We have time for a couple of questions.
You spoke about the use of private laboratories for casework. I suppose this work is not inexpensive, and I wonder what we can do to balance the scales of justice a bit. Do these laboratories work pro bono for defendants? How can this laboratory be made available to both sides of a case under dispute?
You're talking about private laboratories?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, again, I can speak to our own laboratory, which does do work for both the defense and the prosecution. It is fee for service because we're a commercial laboratory. But we're agnostic as to where the cases are coming from. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.